this video, we'll talk about human security. First, we'll see how it is associated with a debate on transformations related to security in the 90s. In this decade, we observe a set of transformations that lead to a reflection on state security and individual security. In addition, there is a particular platform often associated with the concept of human security, the United Nations Development Program. It institutionalized the concept of human security in very specific ways. To understand why it articulates the concept in this way, it is necessary to understand the origin of the concept of development within this notion. Thus, the development problem stands out. In this, we have two important aspects. Its novelty, it is very recent, something typical of the ordering after World War II. Furthermore, within the way the order works, it is difficult to separate the idea of development from the idea of security, for example. In this, the importance of highlighting the function of development as a functional part of this order is notorious. It is necessary to speak of the beginning of the Cold War discourse of cooperation for development, as Truman's vision of development ends up generating resistance that leads us to another concept, which is national developmentalism. This concept is important in peripheral countries at a certain point in the Cold War, in which Brazil, for example, embraces the concept both from the point of view of its domestic policy as well as its foreign policy. Finally, it is relevant to talk about the ideas that led to the crisis in the context of the 90s. The crisis of the national development discourse will lead, firstly, to a neoliberalism, and also to this development alternative that arises from the critique of national development. It is in this that the United Nations Development Program gains strength in the architecture of the UN system as a whole. It organizes this platform around this new discourse on human development that generates the need to transcend the reflection on the subject towards human security. In the end, we work on the dialogue between human development and human security. It is the idea of understanding the problem of security through the relationship between the freedom of will and the freedom of necessity. Finally, we'll talk about the concept that arises from this agenda within the institutional architecture of the United Nations, which is the responsibility to protect. It is the product of a set of works carried out in 2001, central to understanding the dilemma imposed on certain states, as it questions the sovereignty character of states. It proposes a relativization of the notion of sovereignty. Starting this discussion, it is relevant to say that from a realist point of view, while we are within the Hobbesian narrative, we think that the security of the individual is a condition for state security. Considering that only the state has the properties to protect the individual's life as well as that of their peers in relation to foreign forces that create insecurity, we have the notion of guardianship. The state shows the greatest possibility of survival. It seeks to guarantee the right to life. Therefore, the security of the state gains an absolute character, since if it is insecure, the individual will also be insecure. Thus, a degree of submission to the state is a reasonable price to pay to have your security guaranteed. In the context of the 90s, considering the end of the Cold War, due to the type of fragmentation that this scenario presents, it presented wars that are difficult to be understood, in which there is all sorts of brutality. One of the things that the cultural element brings to the narrative of violence is the idea that a state is culturally fragmented, in which there are several groups, and some of them are closer to the institutional power structure and others are further away. In this scenario, it is possible to see that the state apparatus may not necessarily be an instrument of security, but rather of insecurity. Therefore, the militarization of that state may bring more fear than foreign forces. As an example, the case of Sudan can be highlighted. The country's non-Muslim cultural groups are afraid of the Sudanese state, which is in the hands of the country's elites, which puts the army in a position to persecute the Sudanese elite interests and encourage private militias to use violence against cultures that remain in spaces that are valuable to the country's elites. Thus, we can observe the dilemma of the 90s. In the United Nations Development Program, the concept of human security is offered, in which the 1994 Human Development Report is produced. Within the document, a new vision on how to manage the issue of security is articulated in mainly two principles. It is understood that it is important to change the negative view of security for the positive view. In this way, the idea that providing security means avoiding suffering, avoiding conflict, is changed. abolished, and it is replaced with the idea that providing security is a positive exercise. This means security can foster the freedoms that will allow the individual to enjoy social life in different dimensions. Therefore, security not only prevents conflict, it has the power to create something within a society that is not at war, and it increases the individual's ability to enjoy what society offers. This is articulated around two fundamental ideas: freedom from fear and freedom from necessity. Originally, it is understood that this discussion comes from Roosevelt, who speaks of the four freedoms: freedom of expression, belief, fear, and necessity. Thus, the authors use this discussion about freedom from fear and necessity to offer an idea there is an inseparable relationship that needs to be highlighted. This relationship can be understood by considering two scenarios. One of them shows a society in which it is possible to live without being afraid of violence. The second scenario shows that this society has the conditions not to generate despair in certain population groups. This desperation is capable of restricting the choices of the aforementioned group to the point where they need to exert violence to get what they need. The idea of freedom from fear is associated with a negative view of security, how to avoid war, for example. In this way, they seek to show that it is no use preventing crime if their society will continue with the following conditions, for example, if they lack basic infrastructure conditions, if there is a hierarchical structure in an unacceptable proportion, if there is a condition of unbearable misery, in addition to an inequality that results in an inconceivable disparity of opportunities. Therefore, this group that suffers from these conditions can begin to realize that there is no other option but to resort to violence to survive. Thus, it is important to provide the fundamental conditions of need so that despair does not result in the violence that generates fear. Therefore, based on this, it is possible to understand the relationship between fear and need, in which the importance of freedom from fear and need is clear. In this sense, in order to have an understanding of the reasons behind the articulation of human security along the lines mentioned, it is important to highlight how the development program reached this articulation. From this, two important aspects stand out. This discourse is a result of the trajectory of the development problem more than the security problem, and the fact that the problem of development has always been at the basis of the stability of the discourse of the order after the Second World War. Development has always been part of this architecture, which can be seen in the fundamental engineering of the order at the beginning of the Cold War. Returning to Truman's 1949 speech, it is observed that he is seen as one of the great pillars of the U.S. project to overcome the type of instability in the context of the crisis of 29 until the outbreak of the Second World War. The speech presents the idea of the creation of the United Nations, NATO, the Marshall Plan, and the International Cooperation for Development Program. This program is where it will position itself in relation to the periphery of that system. Thus, an idea is seen on how to think about the periphery in front of a scenario with a hegemonic order project and a scenario with an alternative order, where there is a fear that this periphery will be absorbed by its rival. Therefore, a project is needed to absorb this part of the globe with the creation of something that allows peripheral countries to leave a colonial space, but in a way that they are not attracted by communism. From this, it is understood that the program foresaw the idea of offering technical knowledge to enable export corridors. This scenario can be understood as we have the idea that the best way to integrate societies with an agrarian and less industrialized profile within the global economy as a whole would be to allow them to specialize within this profile, to provide the technical instruments to multiply this agrarian productivity and facilitate the export process. In this way, it would facilitate the integration of economies more densely within a network of economic relations in the capitalist world. Thus, it is noteworthy that Truman positioned the U.S. within the Cold War discourse. After the end of the Second World War, with the idea of the polarity of the Cold War, Roosevelt thinks about the order that should be built in a way that would follow the balance of power rather than bipolarity. From this, the metaphor of the four policemen stands out. This idea refers to the four forces that would guarantee the stability as powers of the world that began to emerge after the Second World War. So Truman articulates this debate in another direction. He makes decisions that make this division more inevitable. He needs a project so as not to alienate the system's periphery, since it is a space that is undergoing a process of transformation. Considering that the historical moment presented the countries that were going through a decolonization process, it was necessary to have a project that would integrate these political structures. For this, the use of the concept of development is notorious, because it creates a division that marks the way the system is characterized up to the present day. The division between developed and underdeveloped countries is typical of this period, a product of this discourse. Before, there was the idea of metropolis and colony, which is different because it is a vertical and civilizational division. This can be understood since the idea of metropolis has a civilization project, which the colony does not have access to. Furthermore, the role of the metropolis is to disseminate this project towards the colony, as this is how the relationship between the two is made. Meanwhile, the relationship between development and underdevelopment is a temporal one. This means that there is a moment before consolidated capitalism, a primitive moment. Thus, the underdeveloped state, if it fulfills the stages of development as anticipated by these theories of modernization, could change its position. These theories begin to emerge in the US with the aim of understanding what is the best project to integrate this part of the world into this power project, observing the sphere of influence of capitalism. Thus, one can see the difference with the idea of metropolis and colony in its verticality, in which the colony does not change its position. The relationship between underdeveloped and developed is more horizontal, in which they could change its position. It should be noted that the underdeveloped are behind in relation to the type of experience that allows them to develop their potential. Despite this delay, it should be noted that the situation is not fixed but changeable. Based on this, it is understood that the best way to integrate the global economy is through influencing countries, emphasizing that they must produce what they do best. By integrating everyone into a large capitalist economy, the result tends to be greater integration with greater production of wealth. In the 60s, we had a developmental discourse critical of this idea of comparative advantage and liberal development. It is the discourse of independence theory. This discourse seeks to show two aspects. Initially, we highlight the scenario in which we allow less industrialized countries to industrialize even less based on the confidence of an integrated economy that generates absolute gains for all. From this, we have a result in which commodities of primary products appreciate more slowly than industrialized products. This means that there will be a growing gap between countries. Thus, dependence becomes greater, presenting a more marginal position in relation to developed economies compared to when this process began. In view of the ineffectiveness of this interdependence, in which the project actually generates greater dependence, it is necessary to have a national development project. In Latin America, elites appropriate this resource in a very marked way. As an example, in military governments, it is observed that there has not been a complete removal of this dynamic. This can be understood because Brazil's domestic and foreign policy continued to be marked by this idea that the way to insert itself in the international system in a sustainable manner is through an import substitution program, construction of a sustainable domestic market, and the construction of a primary industry, for example. Thus, we have a political development based on questioning the internationalist character of development. Therefore, we left a development based on liberal internationalism with the idea of comparative advantages with the interaction of the global economy via export corridors. After that, it moved on to a national development project, which coincided with the non-aligned movement at the UN, influential in the 60s, that generated great growth for countries like Brazil. Thus, it is worth emphasizing what happens with this development project. There's the transformations of the 70s, with a context of the oil crisis, for example. In addition, we have the end of the convertibility of the dollar into gold, which has led to the devaluation of the US currency and an ability of US banks to produce more currencies than before. This can be understood from the fact that US currency issuance restrictions were a result of the process of pegging gold to the dollar. Thus, to avoid domestic inflation in the US, private banks are free to lend money abroad. Banks started to make these loans at a very low amount, at a time when Latin American countries needed money to finance the projects that were being implemented. In view of the oil crisis, the price of reserves quickly multiplied. This money is sent to American banks, which will lend it to developing countries. So there is a lot of money circulating towards the periphery at a low price. As a result, they can invest in projects within their countries. Given the scenario of large amounts of loans during the 70s, Latin American countries which were undergoing the National Development Project found themselves in a high debt in the 80s. National developmental discourse loses its strength as the political project seems to have failed. Thus, two important aspects emerge. Initially, it is noteworthy that many countries do not pay their debts, which gives rise to the construction within financial institutions that it was irresponsible for them to lend money to peripheral countries. This creates the conditionality discourse reflected in the International Monetary Fund, for example, called the Washington Consensus. In this, institutions create a discourse about what the conditions are for lending money to developing economies. Thus, the question arises as to how development projects survive when they are no longer national development projects. From this, we have the discourse on human security with an agency created in the 60s. Despite having passed decades since the creation of UNDP, its real relevance is seen in the scenario of the 80s. Within UNDP, it will be built a new development discourse, which presents itself as a technical discourse, different from the political discourse of the United Nations Agency for Trade and Development, also created in the 60s. In contrast to the UNDP, the UNCTAD is an interstate agency governed by the representations of the states that are members of the UN. It was for this reason that this agency was prioritized from the 60s onwards by third world countries. Thus, countries created a development discourse that reflected their needs. UNDP will allow third world countries to create a speech that will criticize UNCTAD. Thus, a counterpoint between national development and human development is created. This is important for understanding the relevance of UNDP in the 90s. UNDP argues that development projects failed in the 80s because they focused on GDP and state bureaucracy. GDP only measures the state's growth. It does not allow us to understand to what extent this growth has increased or reduced inequality in the country, for example. Thus, UNDP questions to what extent the cost of growing a country is worth it, given the underprivileged part of society has less access to political and economic resources. Furthermore, the UNDP emphasizes that for a development project to be effective, it is necessary to have as a fundamental metric the effects of the resource on the individual and not on GDP. Thus, we have a counterpoint between national development and human development. In view of the scenario, the Human Development Index was created in the 90s by the United Nations Development Program. This is relevant because a metric was created to translate into a number the probability of an individual appropriating a certain resource to become richer and able to have autonomy to lead their lives. Thus, the idea is born that loan conditions will be conditioned by projects that are geared towards the Human Development Index. From this, we can highlight how human development becomes human security. This arises from reflections at the World Bank regarding the correlation that marks the instability scenario seen after the Cold War, but which was already a reality in the 80s. The observed correlation is between poverty and inequality on the one hand and violence on the other. This instability is translated into the bipolar tension between the US and the USSR, which marks the context of several countries in Africa and Asia. We have a discourse that marks the cultural narrative and also one of political destabilization, in which someone is supported by the US and another is being supported by the USSR. The World Bank, through its Conflict Trap report, seeks to understand what conditions the reproduction of this violence and what causes it to increase in certain places. It points out a relationship of poverty and inequality on the one hand and violence on the other. This is relevant since it is not enough to manage the stability of these peripheral countries through human development. As an example, we can highlight a scenario in which schools are created, the population is literate, and microcredit is given to farmers. However, this will not be enough because if the instability produced by society remains, this entire infrastructure will be destroyed by violence. Violence creates an absence of opportunity and a scenario of despair, in which certain groups have no option but to mobilize militarily in order to gain access to resources that are not accessible through legitimate institutional channels. As they increase the level of violence, this scenario creates more lack of structure and opportunity that will affect even more people. Therefore, a cyclical movement is observed. This is important because it allows for the transition from a human development discourse to a human security discourse. Therefore, it is necessary to create the conditions for intervention to provide institutional stability to avoid the return of violence, since it is a condition essential for the sustainability of the human development investment projects. Therefore, the mission is to transform a vicious cycle into a virtuous one. Once we give stability to the community, it becomes easier to create schools, etc. Thus, the increase in opportunities brought about by the conditions of human development makes the return of violence more difficult. Furthermore, it is noteworthy that human security unfolds into two important elements: freedom from fear and necessity. Freedom from fear is a condition of negative freedom, marked by the expectation of a return to violence. Freedom from necessity is marked by a set of opportunity structures that do not allow for a scenario in which a certain group is more likely to resort to violence to achieve their needs. Thus, it is understood that the two freedoms complement and reinforce each other. From this discourse gains a space within the UN, in which we have the idea of the responsibility to protect. One of the problems of the discourse based on human security is that for third world countries, it is understood that they are being told how they should carry out their development projects. So, for example, projects will only be financed for a third world country if they agree to it. This is understood as a kind of intervention in the state's capacity to decide its own priorities. This politicization of the human security discourse as a discourse appropriated by first world countries to confront third world countries gains an important space in the discussion on the responsibility to protect. The responsibility to protect is a document created with the objective of redefining within the scope of the UN the problem and the prerogatives of sovereignty. This leads to a relativization of the concept of sovereignty, which third world countries see as something dangerous. The document says that the objective of a country is not to guarantee sovereignty, but to guarantee the human security of its citizens. The issue is, from an international point of view, if country X proves to be incapable or unwilling to promote the human security of its citizens, there is a responsibility of international society to intervene in that country to ensure their human security. It is a speech of legitimization of intervention.